Breaking news, everybody. Guy who's only ever beat Dead Cells at 0 boss cells is making an entire video about Dead Cells. Could possibly be illegal. People will make fun of me. But we're not really here today to talk about the game itself. The game's good. If you haven't played it, go play it. It's been out since 2017. I mean, what am I really gonna add to this conversation? What we're here to talk about is some major indie drama. A slightly confusing piece of conflict that's tied to the end of Dead Cells active support that was announced in February of this year. Now, I'll admit, this isn't exactly my forte as a content creator. I mean, up until recently, the only major indie drama that I was even aware of was the 2014 smash hit Whiplash starring J.K. Simmons. Get it? Because it's a major indie drama. But the reason I still wanted to talk about it, even if it is a little bit late, is I think it brings up some broader questions that I find interesting, like who really makes the games we love? How can marketing carefully skew the truth for a more favorable soundbite? And is there such a thing as earned goodwill for companies in an industry with so much turnover? Before we get into all that though, let's first talk about the problem at hand. Throughout 2023, in multiple interviews, Evil Empire, the current active developers on Dead Cells, claim to have plans to support the game for years to come, at the very least through 2024, and by many accounts through 2025. What comes next, who knows, but those years at least seem to be covered. As late as October of 2023, as evidenced by an Insider Gaming interview with Evil Empire's COO, there were still plenty of plans to keep updating the game, and it was mentioned that future updates would be bigger and more spaced out, but still fairly consistent. People have even claimed that there were some actual roadmaps that alluded to the content coming in 2024 and 2025, but I can't quite track those roadmaps down, so it seems like the claims about the future were less etched in stone and more just really confidently repeated in public forums by the team behind the game. And then all of a sudden, about 4 months after this interview, it was announced that major updates to Dead Cells would stop after the final, now aptly titled End is Near update, an update that was already taking an uncharacteristically long and unorganized path to release, and then outside of some minor patches, support for the game would be over. Now, Dead Cells had an amazing run, selling over 10 million copies as an indie game is beyond ridiculous, and it's received an insane number of updates over the course of 7 years, so it's a little weird saying that its lifespan feels like it's been cut short. But considering the abrupt nature of the announcement, the fact that it seems to contradict past statements, the non-miraculousness of the supposed final update, and the subsequent blog post by a former dev accusing the IP owners of pulling something a little hinky here, there's plenty of reason to believe that something spicy might be stewing behind the scenes. But one thing that makes this narrative a little bit tough to follow at times is that Dead Cells has had quite a bit of turnover in personnel over the years, so I think the first central question we should ask is, who made Dead Cells? This is a surprisingly tough question to answer, and it's only going to get tougher as we go along. Because usually you would just say the company name, right? And you would just be like, oh, they made it. And I said the company name earlier, Evil Empire. I mean, it's their COO answering these questions, so I guess they made Dead Cells. But no, in fact, if you followed Dead Cells' earlier days and haven't been keeping up with it recently, you might even be confused hearing the name Evil Empire associated so heavily with it, because Motion Twin were the original creators of the game when it launched in 2017. That's when it released in early access, after which it hit its 1.0 or full release state in mid-2018, and then in 2019 they handed active development over to the company Evil Empire so that team could keep pushing out updates and growing the game, while Motion Twin began work on a new game we now know as Windblown. One thing that gets mixed up in all of this is that people believe Evil Empire is a subsidiary of Motion Twin, just like an offshoot team whose whole job was to continue Dead Cells while the main team worked on something new, but that's not exactly the case. Evil Empire was established in 2019. Its first project was Dead Cells, and it was founded by former members of the Dead Cells marketing team at Motion Twin, but it operates as an independent company and was simply handed the rights to work on the Dead Cells IP because of the close relationship they had with its creators. That means that Motion Twin hasn't been involved in active development of the game for the last 5 years, a time period that seems to supersede Motion Twin's own development time on the base game, and a time period in which Dead Cells sold 9 million of its 10 million total sales. With all that said though, even though it's clear that Evil Empire had a substantial impact on Dead Cells' life, if you ask somebody based off this information the question, who made Dead Cells, I feel like most people would probably respond, Motion Twin. I mean, props to Evil Empire for what they did, but Motion Twin made Dead Cells. So when their trailer for Windblown, revealed in December of 2023, came with a tagline, "By the creators of Dead Cells," I don't think a lot of people batted an eye. Yeah, Motion Twin made Dead Cells, so Windblown, a game by Motion Twin, is by the creators of Dead Cells. Seems pretty straightforward. But let's talk a little bit more about Motion Twin as a company. Motion Twin operates as a cooperative company. That means there's no CEOs, no bosses, no hierarchy, everyone is on the same playing field and the profit is shared equally. In order to maintain the balance there, they've internally capped their team to never hit more than 10 members, and currently Motion Twin has 9 employees. These employees have shifted around quite a bit in the 20 plus years Motion Twin's been making games. If you're wondering if that means that the entire team from Dead Cells has been completely overhauled though, don't worry. According to a recent Q&A, all but one of Dead Cells' original team members have had a part to play in Windblown, which is true. Technically. A good handful of those devs, particularly those who occupied design and programming roles on the team, left the project early, some as early as 2020 when Windblown was still likely in pre-production. On top of that, a very key member of Motion Twin, Sebastian Bernard, has had very little, if anything, to do with Windblown. Sebastian had been a member of Motion Twin since 2001 and played a part in basically every major aspect of Dead Cells, including development, gameplay, controls, and engine. So okay, a lot of the team did contribute at least a little to Windblown, but some of them left pretty early. Still, a few people from the core Dead Cells team are currently working on the new game. According to Motion Twin, half of their current team has carried over from Dead Cells, which I guess means 4.5 people. Not quite sure how that's possible, but maybe one guy's dad worked on Dead Cells and his mom was Hispanic or something? I don't know. Going based off of their employee list, there are in fact 4 people that worked on Dead Cells currently working on Windblown. I guess they did like a 23andMe on that one guy. So this statement, that Windblown is by the creators of Dead Cells, is a little flimsier than it might have first seemed, but I still think it holds some weight. But we're not quite done. Of those 4 employees, one of them joined late 2016, right before the game launched in its early access state, and another joined late 2018, under a year before development duties were passed on to Evil Empire. Now, I don't say any of this to undermine the work these people did at the company, far from it. I'm not trying to say that these people didn't have contributions to the game, that would be stupid. But if they're considered as core members of the Dead Cells team, as declared by Motion Twin themselves, especially since they're some of the only ones holding this precariously dangling statement up, what's stopping Evil Empire from also being considered core members of Dead Cells? Not that Motion Twin has ever outwardly claimed that they aren't, but to touch back on our big question of who made Dead Cells, I mean, if some of the only remaining contributing members of Dead Cells still on Windblown joined later in development, but are still accepted by the general public as the creators of Dead Cells because they're tied to the Motion Twin name, what about the members of the Evil Empire team who joined not long after at all and worked on the project for 5 years? It's 5 most successful years at that. None of this undercuts what any individual or group has done for the game, but it does kind of show how that big question that we talked about earlier goes from a black and white answer to something a little bit more complicated. Who created Dead Cells? Well, it's Motion Twin, but it's not quite the current Motion Twin, but still some of them. It's also Evil Empire, not just for their work, but also the fact that a founding member of that company is listed as a core member of the original Dead Cells team. And it's also Sebastian Bernard and all these other creative forces from a small team that have gone to do other things. And this all goes well past Dead Cells also. Whenever a major contributor to a project leaves for a different company, there's a chance that the new game they're involved in is also dubbed as from the creators of, or from the minds behind something you love. But realistically, you don't know how big of a part of that project they were, and obviously the full dynamics of the team are important to the final product as well, which means that this statement becomes more of a fluff piece to instill confidence rather than any real information. This is far from the only situation we've seen something like this, so I'm not accusing Motion Twin of shady marketing tactics, for this statement at least. But I do think it's an interesting look at the level of turnover that can take place on a team in just a few years, and how marketing can always skew that into a positive light regardless. Using phrasing like, all but one member of that game you love also contributed to this game, and half of our current staff worked on that game you like, is good marketing, but it never really means exactly what you think it means. It really all comes down to the Theseus paradox. If every element of an object is replaced over time, even in an identical fashion, can it still be considered the same object? And if the Motion Twin that initially created Dead Cells has been almost entirely overhauled, is Windblown really by the creators of Dead Cells? But if the question of who made this game was the only confusing part of this whole process, I probably wouldn't have made it a whole video, to be honest. I mean, sure, it's a nice little window into the ever-changing nature of these development teams, but it also feels a little bit rude to look at an indie studio especially and say, you're not who you really say you are, because that feels kind of, I don't know, unfair. The game's the game, that's just how it is. But that is not the only issue at hand. Remember when I said that Dead Cells development felt like it was cut short? The whole thing seemed kind of rushed and sudden? Well, the prevailing theory is that Dead Cells updates were canned to make way for Windblown's marketing. Windblown and Dead Cells don't completely overlap as games, but they do occupy the same roguelite space, and it may be harder to convince people that the Dead Cells team is making Windblown when Dead Cells is continuing development at the same time. After all, most people don't really follow the ins and outs of which company's making what, and may not really realize how the team's been split or members are being carried over. That is a bit of a harsh accusation to throw around though. I mean, not only does it imply that a dedicated fan base was left out to dry, even though it was promised more content just because of a marketing opportunity, but it also suggests that Evil Empire, who clearly had more ideas to add to the game, was kicked off the project unceremoniously to make room for a different company's game to maybe sell better. But there are a lot of reasons to believe this might be the case. For starters, the announcement of the end of active Dead Cells support came just 2 months after Windblown was revealed and interest in the project could be gauged. The game had been in development since 2019, so for the end of Dead Cells to feel so unplanned when internally they knew when their next game would release does feel reactionary to a degree. The relationship between Motion Twin and Evil Empire reaching an abrupt and potentially unpleasant end is also indicated by the fact that Evil Empire has completely stopped work on Dead Cells cold turkey, and Motion Twin has apparently picked up the remaining development for the final update. Evil Empire was in the middle of beta testing this update right before the news broke out, and now suddenly, after 5 years of a hands-off approach, Motion Twin is now picking up the last update midway through. That seems like a bad breakup. But most tellingly, Sebastian Bernard, the former key member of Motion Twin I mentioned earlier, made a few claims off the heels of the end of update announcement, saying that based off what he knew internally, this whole thing was an asshole move from what he dubbed as a greedy company. He says that the Windblown team is almost entirely separate from the Dead Cells one, and even further downplays some of the connections that they do have. He also suggests that maybe they grew resentful of Evil Empire's ever-increasing ties to Dead Cells' name, which is another claim that fans seem to echo. I guess it's not hard to imagine a level of inadequacy or insecurity or just fear of losing brand recognition that could stem from a different studio gaining more and more credit for something you started, especially since you went through enough changes over the last few years to leave you with arguably less of the game's DNA in your team than they have in theirs. Sebastian even says himself that Evil Empire is the only true Dead Cells studio at this point, and Motion Twin losing that reputation is bad for business. So these are obviously all very scathing claims, and my title is kind of scathing also, but one thing I do want to clarify is that none of this is definitive, and my title especially is, it's like a spicy piece of clickbait pie, okay? I don't think you need to boycott Windblown. I think we should be conscious of the fact that we don't really know what's going on and what's happening internally. Obviously you can come to whatever conclusion you want, but I say it's always good to take these things with a grain of salt. Way too many vague situations like this get flipped on their head after new information is revealed, so don't take any conclusions here as pure fact. On that note, actually, I should probably talk about some of the response from Motion Twin to this backlash. They did put out a huge FAQ a little while after these claims from fans and Sebastian, and it felt like a way to address the situation without alerting more people to the fact that there was a situation worth addressing. They sort of hide their responses inside a series of vague hype statements about Windblown and constant mentions of how it's connected to the Dead Cells team. It is worded a little bit strangely, but they also address some things head on. On the claim that they had plans for Dead Cells all the way till 2025, they basically say, we jumped the gun a little bit with talking about that. These were always discussions we were having, but they weren't concrete plans. There was no roadmap saying 2025. Calm down everybody, there's no conspiracy, we just changed directions with the game. They also mentioned that development could have continued in tandem with Windblown development since, well, there are different companies working on it, but they just felt that Dead Cells was complete and didn't need to overstay its welcome. By all accounts, Evil Empire still had ideas they were hoping to implement, Motion Twin didn't have to spend any development costs on the game, and they were making money off the IPs, so I'm not sure if that "it felt complete" response holds a ton of weight, but it is their official stance. They also directly addressed the question of whether Dead Cells was shut down to prop up Windblown, and they mentioned that the question hurts because why would they ever do such a thing? They love Dead Cells. But then they do just kind of double down on the whole "it felt finished" idea and leave it at that. A lot of people saw this FAQ as a strange bit of corporate manipulation masquerading as a relatable discussion with fans, and I will say I feel kind of similarly, but again, I am not getting the pitchforks out unless we get some more concrete information. Up until now, this is just a hypothesis. a game hypothesis. I'll also say that while I have no doubt that Sebastian does have more information than the general public given how close he is to the situation, a lot of his comments aren't the most concrete. He extrapolates a lot from what he claims was the pre-Dead Cells identity of Motion Twin, which was to provide minimal support for their games, but given the turnover that he himself is pointing out, it seems a little bit weird to base their current philosophy on their old culture. He also presents his conclusions as more of an educated guess than anything, basically just saying, this makes the most sense. Again, not to say that he's wrong on any of it, but don't take it as pure fact. I think the most ironic part of all this is that if the goal truly was to prop up Motion Twin as the true Dead Cells team and also market Windblown, that kind of completely backfired. I mean, I didn't even question the whole creators of Dead Cells claim until this situation drew my attention to it. Ultimately, I think if the Dead Cells community was left out to dry for a poorly planned marketing move, that's pretty scummy, but the rest of the marketing tactics are just a bit of insight into how the corporate game is played. So many of your favorite dev teams have probably replaced the vast majority of their employees since that last game you loved, and that's something we need to both accept and be made more aware of. Names hold a lot of power, but you should never let a company fool you into thinking that name is interchangeable with personnel, identity, or quality. I'm really curious to know what you guys all think about this though. Do you feel like the criticisms levied against Motion Twin are fair, and what do you think about the Theseus paradox in the entertainment industry? If you have any thoughts, leave them in the comments, like the video, subscribe, join the Discord, it's in the description, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.